Last week, someone from Brazil commented that they listen to these stories at midnight while the rain falls outside their window, and it made me realize something beautiful about what we've built here. We're scattered across the globe, different continents, different languages, different lives, but we find each other in these dark hours, drawn together by stories of people who refused to be forgotten, people who were overlooked and underestimated and dismissed. People who discovered that someone had been watching all along. Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge. Speaking of which, where are you right now? Drop your city and what time it is where you are. I genuinely want to know, because tonight's story kept me awake. Tonight's story made me set down my pen and simply sit with the weight of it. This is the story of a woman who was sold by her own father for £500. £500. That's what he decided his only daughter was worth. Enough to clear a gambling debt. Enough to buy himself another few months of reckless living. Enough to make his daughter someone else's problem. But here's what her father didn't know. Here's what no one in England knew, except for one man who had guarded his secret for 7 long years. The Duke who paid that money, the Duke who everyone believed had purchased a ruined gentleman's spinster daughter on a whim, had been watching her since she was 16 years old. 7 years of silent devotion. 7 years of protecting her from shadows she never saw. 7 years of waiting until the moment was right. And when she stood before him on her wedding night, trembling, expecting cruelty, expecting to pay the price of her father's sins with her body and her freedom, he looked into her eyes and whispered words that changed everything. I've waited 7 years for this. Let me take you back to where this story truly begins. Not the wedding, not the sale, but a summer afternoon in 1840 when the world was golden with our sunlight and a 16-year-old girl with ink-stained fingers disappeared into a garden to read. The Ashby estate sprawled across the Hampshire countryside like something from a painting. Emerald lawns rolling toward distant woods, white tents billowing in the warm breeze, ladies in pastel gowns drifting between rose bushes like flowers themselves. The air smelled of cut grass and roses and the particular sweetness of English summer, and somewhere a string quartet played something light and forgettable. It was the event of the season, and everyone who mattered in society had come to see and be seen. Octavia Mercer had come only because her mother insisted. You must make connections, Mrs. Mercer had said that morning, her thin hands trembling as she pinned a ribbon into her daughter's hair. The trembling was new, a symptom of the illness that would claim her life within 2 years, though none of them knew it yet. You must be seen, my darling. Your father's situation grows more precarious by the day. If you could catch the eye of someone respectable. I know, Mamma. Octavia had caught her mother's hands, stilled them, pressed a kiss to her papery knuckles. She could feel the bones beneath the skin, too prominent, too fragile. I'll try. But trying for Octavia meant something different than it did for other girls. Other girls tried by laughing prettily and agreeing with everything gentlemen said. Other girls tried by positioning themselves in doorways and dropping handkerchiefs. Octavia tried by enduring as long as she could before the noise and the falseness drove her to seek refuge. She lasted 2 hours at the Ashby garden party. 2 hours of polite smiles and empty conversation, of pretending to care about ribbons and weather and which young lord had danced with which young lady at last week's assembly. 2 hours before she slipped away from the crowd, following a winding path through the gardens until she found a stone bench half hidden by a cascade of purple wisteria. The blooms hung so thick they created a curtain, a secret room of petals and green light, and the air was heavy with their sweetness. Octavia settled onto the bench, pulled the novel from her reticule. She always carried a novel, always, because books were the only reliable escape she had, and let the world fall away. She was reading A Tale of Two Cities, and she had reached the part where Sidney Carton walks to the guillotine. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done," she whispered to herself, her voice catching on the beauty of it, and she did not notice the man standing frozen at the edge of the wisteria curtain. Constantine Harcourt, the newly invested Duke of Redmore, had come to the garden party because Lady Ashby had been his mother's dearest friend, and he could not refuse her anything. His mother had been dead for 2 years now. Consumption, the same disease that would later claim Octavia's mother, and Constantine moved through the world like a man made of ice, cold, distant, untouchable. He was 24 years old and already exhausted by everything society offered. The matchmaking mothers who thrust their daughters at him like sacrificial offerings, the simpering debutantes who agreed with his every word, who laughed at jokes he hadn't made, who looked at his title and his fortune and never once looked at him. Now, I need to pause here and tell you something about Constantine Harcourt, because understanding the kind of man he was, understanding why he became what he became, is essential to this story. Constantine had never been normal. From his earliest childhood, he had been different in ways that made his tutors uncomfortable and his father despair. He fixated. That was the word his mother had used, gently, lovingly, as if it were a gift rather than a flaw. When something captured Constantine's interest, he couldn't let it go. He would read every book on a subject, learn everything there was to know, think about nothing else until he had mastered it completely. At 7, he had memorized every constellation visible from England and could speak about astronomy for hours without pause. At 12, he had learned Latin, Greek, and French in a single year because a book he wanted to read hadn't been translated. At 16, he had become obsessed with estate management and had reorganized his father's entire agricultural system, increasing yields by 30%. His father called it obsession. His tutors called it concerning. His mother called it passion. And she taught him to channel it, to use it productively, to recognize when he was spiraling and pull himself back. "You feel things more deeply than other people," she had told him once when he was 12 years old and devastated over a stable cat that had died. He had wept for 3 days. His father had called him weak. His mother had held him and whispered, "That's not weakness. My darling, that's a heart too big for this world. You must learn to protect it, or it will destroy you." She had been his only ally, the only person who understood that his intensity wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but a fire to be carefully tended. The only person who saw past the title and the wealth and the expectations to the strange, burning boy beneath. When she died of consumption in 1838, Constantine felt something in himself die too. The part that knew how to connect with people. The part that believed anyone would ever truly understand him. He had resigned himself to a life of isolation. A cold duke in a cold castle, managing his estates, doing his duty, feeling nothing. It seemed easier that way, safer. And then he saw her. She was crying over a book. Constantine stood at the edge of the wisteria, hidden by the hanging blooms, and watched a girl with ink-stained fingers weep for a fictional man's sacrifice. She wasn't performing grief the way society women performed. Everything. She wasn't dabbing delicately at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She was genuinely moved, genuinely transported, genuinely feeling something for people who existed only on the page. Her tears fell freely. Her shoulders shook. Her lips moved, forming the words as she read them, as if she were praying. When was the last time he had felt anything that deeply? His mother's funeral, 2 years ago. Since then, nothing. Emptiness. Ice. But watching this girl cry over Sydney Carton's sacrifice, Constantine felt something crack open in his chest, a door he had thought permanently sealed, a room he had thought forever dark. She was not beautiful. He noticed this clinically, the way he noticed everything. Her features were too sharp, her colouring too pale, her figure too thin. Her gown was well made, but clearly not new. He could see where it had been altered, where seams had been let out and taken in again. Her hair was escaping its pins, dark curls tumbling around a face that was remarkable only in its expressiveness. But when she whispered those words, "It is a far, far better thing," and her voice cracked with genuine emotion, Constantine understood something with absolute clarity. This girl felt things the way he felt things. Too much, too deeply. She lived in books because the real world couldn't contain her intensity. She hid in gardens because society had no place for people who experienced everything at full volume. She was like him. She was the one. He did not approach her. He couldn't. His throat had closed around words he didn't know how to say. What would he even tell her? That he had been watching her cry and found it the most captivating thing he had ever witnessed. That her ink-stained fingers made him want to know what she wrote, what she thought, what worlds existed inside her mind. She would think him mad. She would be right. So he simply watched. He watched her finish the chapter, watched her close the book and press it to her chest as if embracing the characters within. He watched her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. Not a handkerchief, just her hand, unself-conscious and real. And take a steadying breath. He watched her compose herself to return to the party, squaring her shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. He watched her walk away, and he did not follow, though every instinct screamed at him to do so. Instead, he found Lady Ashby. "The girl in the garden," he said, and something in his voice must have been strange because Lady Ashby's eyebrows rose. "Dark hair. Reading alone. Who is she?" "Octavia Mercer." Lady Ashby's tone was carefully neutral, the tone of a society matron who knew things she wasn't saying. "Sir William Mercer's daughter. A sweet girl, but the family has fallen on difficulties. The father gambles, I'm afraid. The mother is unwell. It's unlikely the girl will make any sort of match worth speaking of." Constantine nodded. He filed the information away. And that night, lying in his vast empty bed, in his vast empty house, he made a decision. He would learn everything about Octavia Mercer. He would protect her from the consequences of her father's weakness. He would wait until she was old enough, until he had become the kind of man who deserved her, until the moment was right, and then he would make her his. The watching began. He hired investigators. He bribed servants. He called in favours from men who owed him and asked questions that would have seemed bizarre from anyone less powerful. Within a month, he knew more about Octavia Mercer than her own father did. He knew that she woke every morning at dawn to help her mother dress, because the maid had been let go and they couldn't afford another. He knew that she spent her afternoons reading aloud to her mother, choosing cheerful stories to mask the progression of Mrs. Mercer's illness. Adventure tales and comedies, nothing sad, nothing that might make her mother weep. He knew that she wrote in a journal, every night before bed, filling page after page with thoughts she could share with no one. He knew that her father had gambled away her dowry, her mother's jewellery, and the family's last profitable estate. He knew that creditors came to the door with increasing frequency, and that Octavia had learned to lie to them with a straight face. He knew that she was slowly drowning, and no one was reaching down to save her. Constantine decided he would be the one to reach. But not yet. She was only 16, too young for marriage, too young for the weight of his attention. He would wait. He would watch. He would ensure that no one else claimed her while he prepared himself to be worthy of her. In 1841, Mrs. Mercer's health declined sharply. Constantine received reports of Octavia spending entire days at her mother's bedside, reading until her voice gave out, holding her mother's hand through the long nights when the coughing wouldn't stop. The reports described a girl who never complained, who smiled through exhaustion, who told her dying mother that everything would be fine, even as the shadows grew darker under her eyes. Constantine wanted to send doctors, the best doctors in London, specialists who might ease her mother's suffering. But he couldn't, not without revealing himself, not without making Octavia wonder who this mysterious benefactor was and why he cared. So he watched from a distance and felt helpless for the first time in his life. In the winter of 1842, Mrs. Mercer died. Constantine stood at the back of the churchyard on the day of the funeral, hidden among bare winter trees, his breath fogging in the frozen air. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the graves in white, and the world was silent except for the vicar's droning voice and the distant caw of crows. He watched Octavia stand beside the open grave in a black dress that was too thin for the weather. She was shivering, he could see it even from this distance, and no one had thought to give her a coat. Her father stood beside her, weeping theatrical tears, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief while his daughter stood frozen and dry-eyed. Sir William had always been more concerned with appearances than with genuine feeling. Even now, at his wife's funeral, he was performing grief rather than experiencing it. But Octavia wasn't performing anything. She was simply enduring, holding herself so still that she might have been carved from ice. Constantine watched her walk away from her mother's grave alone, because her father had already departed to find solace in a bottle, and something in his chest cracked open. She was 18 years old. She was alone in the world, and he loved her with an intensity that frightened even him. That spring, Sir William's debts began to spiral out of control. The man gambled as if determined to lose everything, and he very nearly succeeded. Now, I need to explain something crucial about how debt worked in Victorian England, because it's essential to understanding the danger Octavia was in. Danger she never knew existed. Danger that Constantine spent years standing between her and. In the 1840s, debt wasn't just a financial inconvenience, it was a criminal matter. Debtor's prison was a real and terrifying consequence of unpaid obligations. The Fleet, the Marshalsea, the King's Bench. These were prisons where men could be held indefinitely for owing money. But here's the cruel irony that made the system so devastating. While imprisoned for debt, a man could not work to repay what he owed. He was trapped, unable to earn, watching interest accumulate while his family starved outside the prison walls. Some men spent decades in debtor's prison. Some died there. Entire families were destroyed, wives and children reduced to begging or the workhouse, while fathers rotted away for debts as small as £5. For a man of Sir William's station, debtor's prison would have meant complete social annihilation. But imprisonment wasn't the worst fate his debts could bring. Some of his creditors were not gentlemen. Some operated in the shadows of London's underworld, and they collected their debts in currencies other than money. A man who couldn't pay might find his daughter offered as compensation. It happened more often than society cared to admit. Young women disappeared into houses of ill repute, sold by desperate fathers or seized by ruthless creditors, never to be seen again. Constantine identified these dangerous creditors first. He bought their debts from them, quietly, anonymously, through a chain of solicitors and intermediaries that couldn't be traced back to him. Sir William received letters informing him that certain obligations had been forgiven due to circumstances, and he was too relieved and too drunk to question his good fortune. He had no idea that a duke was standing between his daughter and ruin. The first real test of Constantine's resolve came in the autumn of 1843, when Baron Ashworth began circling Octavia like a vulture scenting carrion. The Baron was 62 years old, twice widowed, and notorious for his appetites. His first wife had died in childbirth, tragic but common. His second wife had died of a fall down the stairs, and while no one could prove anything, whispers followed the Baron like a foul odour. Servants who had worked in his household spoke of screaming in the night, of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of a woman who flinched whenever her husband entered a room. He was rich, though, rich enough that some fathers would overlook the whispers. Sir William was one of those fathers. Constantine learned of the negotiation through his network of informants. Sir William had met with the Baron privately and terms were being discussed. The Baron was offering to clear all of Sir William's debts, a substantial sum, in exchange for Octavia's hand. Constantine did not sleep that night. He paced his study until dawn, his mind racing through possibilities, his hands shaking with a rage he could barely contain. The thought of that man touching Octavia, the thought of her trapped in a house with a monster who had likely murdered his previous wife. No, he would burn down London before he allowed it. He began his investigation immediately. The Baron's household, past and present, his finances, his habits, his secrets. Constantine had learned long ago that every man had secrets, and powerful men simply had more to hide. It took 3 weeks to find what he needed. The second Baroness Ashworth had not fallen down the stairs. She had been pushed, by her husband, in a fit of rage over her failure to produce an heir. The incident had been witnessed by a chambermaid who had been paid handsomely to forget what she saw. But the chambermaid had not forgotten. She had written down everything in detail and hidden the account in case she ever needed protection. Constantine bought that account for £50. Then he bought the chambermaid's passage to America, where she would be safe from the Baron's reach. The morning after the Baron's final meeting with Sir William, the meeting where the marriage contract would have been signed, Baron Ashworth received a visitor at his London townhouse. Constantine came alone without announcement, pushing past the butler with the casual authority of a man who owned half of England. The Baron was in his study, a glass of port already in his hand despite the early hour. The room smelled of tobacco and old books and something sour beneath, fear perhaps, or guilt. His eyes widened when he saw who had entered. "Your Grace, I wasn't expecting, that is, I had no idea you would—" "Sit down." Constantine's voice was ice. "And listen carefully, because I will only say this once." He placed a document on the Baron's desk. A copy of the chambermaid's account, every detail of the murder, every moment of the Baroness's final terror, written in a hand that shook with remembered horror. The Baron's face went grey as he read. "You will withdraw your offer to Sir William Mercer today," Constantine said. "You will cite a change in circumstances, a new financial obligation, whatever lie suits you best. You will never speak to Octavia Mercer again. You will never look at her again. You will never think about her again. You will forget she exists. You can't. I could have you charged with— With what?" Constantine stepped closer, and something in his expression made the Baron shrink back into his chair. His eyes, usually so controlled, so cold, burned with something ancient and terrible. "I am the Duke of Redmore. I have more money than you will see in 10 lifetimes. I have connections in every court, every government office, every newspaper in London. I can send copies of that document to every publication in England. I can ensure that you spend your remaining years rotting in a cell awaiting trial for murder. I can destroy you so, completely that your name becomes a curse word." He leaned down until his face was inches from the Baron's, close enough to see the sweat beading on the older man's forehead. "Or you can walk away from one insignificant girl, and I will forget I ever learned your secrets. The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Choose quickly." The Baron chose wisely. That afternoon, Sir William received a letter of regret. The Baron's circumstances had changed. The arrangement was impossible. Sir William cursed and drank himself into a stupor, never suspecting that his daughter had just been saved from a fate worse than death. Octavia never knew how close she had come. But Constantine knew. He went home to Redmore that night and sat in his study in the dark, staring at a sketch he had commissioned of her from memory. Her face in the garden, tears on her cheeks, book pressed to her heart. She was 20 years old now. He had been watching her for 4 years, and he had just destroyed a man. Threatened. Him? Terrified him? Sent him fleeing from negotiations like a whipped dog. to keep her safe. This is what love had made him. This is what he was willing to become. The second intervention came in 1844 when a wealthy merchant's son named Harold Swinton expressed interest in Octavia. Swinton was not old like the Baron. He was 35, handsome in a flashy way, recently wealthy from trade in textiles. Society looked down on him for his common origins, but his money opened doors that breeding could not. He saw in Octavia a prize. A gentleman's daughter, however impoverished, would lend respectability to his name. Sir William saw in Swinton a solution. The merchant offered no settlement. He wanted a dowry that didn't exist, but he was willing to overlook the lack of funds in exchange for Octavia's bloodline and connection to the aristocracy. Constantine might have allowed this match. Swinton was not monstrous like the Baron. He was merely vulgar, social climbing, the kind of man who would bore Octavia, but probably not harm her. But then Constantine's investigators discovered the truth about Swinton's first wife. Margaret Swinton had died 3 years prior, officially of a fever. In reality, she had died of a fever brought on by injuries sustained in a fall. A fall that her servants whispered had been no accident. Swinton had a temper. Swinton had hands that left bruises. Margaret Swinton had tried to leave him twice, and both times he had dragged her back. The second time she had tried to run to her family and Swinton had broken her arm for the attempt. The pattern was too similar to ignore. Constantine could not, would not deliver Octavia into the hands of another man who solved his problems with violence. He did not confront Swinton directly. Instead, he ensured that the truth found its way to the right ears. A magistrate who owed Constantine a favour. A physician who had treated Margaret's accidents and could be persuaded to share his concerns. A journalist who specialised in exposing the sins of the wealthy. Within a month, Harold Swinton's name was mud. Rumours swirled through every drawing room in London. Former servants came forward with stories of screaming and broken furniture, and a woman who flinched whenever her husband raised his voice. The investigation never resulted in formal charges. There wasn't enough evidence for that, but the damage was done. Swinton fled to the continent to escape the scandal, and another threat to Octavia vanished. Sir William raged about his bad luck. How was it possible that every promising match dissolved before contracts could be signed? Surely fate was conspiring against him. He had no idea that fate wore a ducal coronet and watched his daughter through windows at night. In 1845, Sir William remarried. His new wife was Mrs. Dorothea Fenton, a widow with 2 daughters of her own, plain girls named Agnes and Martha, both still unmarried despite their mother's best efforts. Dorothea was not wealthy, but she was ambitious. She had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and she had spent years waiting for an opportunity to climb. She saw in Sir William a family name that could elevate her daughters. She saw in his household a place where she could reign as mistress. And she saw in Octavia a rival. The campaign began subtly. A word here, a look there. Dorothea commenting at breakfast that Octavia's gown was looking rather worn. Perhaps we should give it to the scullery maid, dear. She might get some use from it. Dorothea mentioning at dinner that Agnes and Martha needed new ribbons for their hair. And wasn't it a shame there wasn't enough money for everyone? Dorothea sighing heavily whenever Octavia entered a room, as if her very presence was a burden too great to bear. Sir William said nothing. He was too busy drinking and gambling to notice his daughter being slowly erased from her own home. And perhaps, if he did notice, he simply didn't care. The first real blow came 3 months after the wedding, when Dorothea decided she wanted the sapphire necklace. It was the last piece of jewellery from Octavia's mother, a delicate strand of sapphires and pearls that Mrs. Mercer had worn on her own wedding day. Octavia had hidden it when the other jewellery was sold, keeping it wrapped in one of her mother's handkerchiefs, tucked beneath her mattress. It was the only thing she had left of the woman who had loved her. Some nights, when the loneliness became unbearable, she would take it out and hold it, pressing the cool stones against her cheek, imagining she could still smell her mother's perfume. Dorothea found it during a routine inspection of Octavia's room. An inspection that involved opening every drawer, searching every corner, and examining every item Octavia owned. "What's this?" Dorothea held up the necklace, her eyes glittering with triumph. "Hiding valuables, are we? When the household can barely afford candles?" "It was my mother's. Octavia's." Voice was steady, but her hands had begun to shake. "It's all I have left of her, please." Sentimental nonsense. Dorothea fastened the necklace around her own throat, examining herself in the mirror with evident satisfaction. The sapphires looked garish against her sallow skin, but she smiled as if they had been made for her. "This will look lovely on Martha at the Pemberton ball. Blue brings out her eyes. Unless you'd like to explain to your father why you've been hoarding jewellery while he struggles to pay his debts." Octavia said nothing. What could she say? She had no power here. She had no rights, no money, no one to defend her. She watched her mother's sapphires walk out of the room around her stepmother's neck, and something inside her went quiet. The indignities escalated after that. In the spring of 1846, Dorothea announced that the house needed reorganization. Agnes and Martha each required their own bedrooms, she explained, rooms befitting young ladies of their station. Octavia's room, the room she had slept in since childhood, the room where her mother had read to her and brushed her hair and told her she was loved, would be perfect for Martha. "You can move to the room near the servants' quarters," Dorothea said, not even looking at Octavia as she spoke. She was examining her nails, as if this conversation bored her. "It's smaller, but perfectly adequate for someone with your limited prospects." Sir William nodded absently, already reaching for his glass. "Whatever you think best, my dear." Octavia moved her belongings herself. No one offered to help. Not the servants, who had been warned not to show her favouritism, and certainly not her stepsisters, who watched from the doorway of their new rooms with smug satisfaction. She carried her books, her mother's handkerchief, empty now, no sapphires to protect, her worn dresses and mended shoes. She walked down the narrow stairs to the servants' wing, past the kitchen where the cook pretended not to see her, and opened the door to a room barely larger than a closet. There was a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped basin, a small window that looked out onto the coal shed. The walls were bare plaster, stained with damp in one corner. It smelled of mildew and neglect. She sat on the edge of the bed and didn't cry. She had learned over the past year that crying accomplished nothing. It only gave Dorothea satisfaction. But that night, in her journal, she wrote words that Constantine's bribed servant would later copy and deliver to him. "Someday, someone will look at me and see something worth keeping. Someday, I will be more than a burden to be managed, a mouth to be fed, a daughter to be sold. Someday someone will choose me not because they have to, not because they're paid to, but because they want to. Is that too much to hope for? Perhaps. But I hope anyway because hope is all I have left." Constantine wept when he read those words. He pressed the page to his lips and made a silent vow. He would be that someone. He would choose her. He would keep her. And when the time came, she would understand that she had never been invisible to him, not for one single day. The worst night came in the autumn of 1846, a year before the sale. Sir William was hosting a dinner party, an attempt to maintain appearances, to pretend the family wasn't drowning in debt. Dorothea had invited several eligible gentlemen for Agnes and Martha to impress. The table was set with borrowed silver. The food had been purchased on credit. The wine was cheap but presented in expensive bottles. Octavia was not invited to attend as a guest. "Someone needs to oversee the servants," Dorothea had explained, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Make sure the courses come out correctly, the wine is poured properly. You understand, I'm sure. Agnes and Martha need every advantage, and having you at the table would only distract from them." Distract? Octavia kept her voice, neutral though her nails dug into her palms. You know how it is, dear. Men don't want to look at a charity case while they're eating. It spoils their appetite. And so Octavia spent the evening standing in the shadows of the dining room, watching her stepsisters giggle and flirt, while she ensured their wine glasses stayed full. She wore a plain grey dress, Dorothea had insisted, saying servants should look like servants. Her hair was pulled back severely. Her mother's sapphires, her sapphires, glittered around Agnes's throat. One of the gentlemen noticed her. A young viscount, slightly drunk, emboldened by wine. "I say," he said loudly, "who's the pretty one in the corner? A bit drab, but there's something about her." "That's just the stepdaughter," Dorothea interrupted smoothly, waving her hand dismissively. "Poor thing has no prospects at all. Practically a servant, really. Agnes, dear, tell Lord Pemberton about your watercolours. Practically a servant." The words hung in the air like a slap. Octavia felt every eye in the room slide over her and then away, dismissing her, forgetting her. She slipped out of the room as soon as she could. No one noticed her leave. No one ever noticed. She climbed the narrow stairs to her tiny chamber and sat on the edge of her bed until dawn, staring at the wall, wondering if there was any point in continuing to exist. The world had made it very clear that she didn't matter, that she would never matter, that she was just a burden to be managed until someone finally figured out how to dispose of her. She thought about the river, about how cold the water would be this time of year, about how easy it would be to simply stop. But then she thought about her mother, about the books her mother had read to her, the stories of women who endured and survived and found their way to something better, about the promise she had made at her mother's grave, to keep living, to keep hoping, to believe that someday things would change. She didn't go to the river. She stayed in her small, cold room and she wrote in her journal, and she waited for a someday she was no longer sure would ever come. Constantine knew. His informant told him everything: the grey dress, the serving duties, the casual cruelty of practically a servant. He spent that night pacing his study, fighting the urge to ride to London immediately to drag Octavia out of that house, to burn it to the ground with her tormentors inside. But he couldn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready. She wasn't ready. If he revealed himself now, Sir William would demand a settlement, and Dorothea would find ways to poison everything. He had to wait for the right moment, the moment when he could claim her completely and irrevocably. He had to wait. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He began collecting things. He knew it was obsessive. He knew it was disturbing, possibly mad, certainly inappropriate, but he couldn't stop himself, and after a while, he stopped trying. A ribbon. Green silk, fallen from her hair at a musicale she had been permitted to attend, one of her rare appearances in society. Constantine had been standing across the room, watching her laugh at something a young woman said. One of her rare, genuine laughs, so unexpected and beautiful that it stopped his breath, when the ribbon had slipped loose and drifted to the floor. He had retrieved it after she left. He kept it in a locked drawer in his study, and sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and run it through his fingers, imagining he could feel the warmth of her hair. A flower. A pressed rose from a bouquet she had carried at a garden party. He had bribed a servant to steal it before it was thrown away. The petals were brown now, fragile as aged paper, but he kept it between the pages of a book she had once touched. A page from her diary. This was the hardest acquisition, and the one that shamed him most. He had paid her former lady's maid, a desperate woman supporting 3 younger siblings, to copy one page, just one, from the journal Octavia wrote in each night. The maid had chosen a page at random, and Constantine had read it so many times the words were burned into his memory. He read that page every night before he slept. He traced her handwriting with his fingertip. He imagined what it would feel like to have her write those words to him, for him, about him. Someday, someone will choose me. I choose you, he thought. I chose you 7 years ago, and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. The time came in autumn of 1847. Sir William's debts had finally outpaced Constantine's ability to manage them discreetly. The man had borrowed from everyone: merchants, moneylenders, fellow gamblers, men who operated outside the law entirely. Even the debts Constantine had paid off had been replaced by new ones, larger ones, debts owed to people who could not be easily managed. Whispers of debtors' prison had begun. Sir William knew that consequences, imprisonment, ruin, the dissolution of everything he had left. Dorothea was frantic. Her grand plans of marrying her daughters to wealthy men would collapse if her husband was thrown in prison for debt. And then Sir William had an idea. His daughter, his only remaining asset. Octavia was 23 years old now, long past her prime marriageable age. She had no dowry, no prospects, and years of mistreatment had worn away whatever brightness she had once possessed. But she was still a gentleman's daughter. She was still the granddaughter of an earl on her mother's side. Some men would pay for that bloodline. Sir William put out quiet inquiries. A daughter. Available for the right price. Not advertised openly. That would be too scandalous. But mentioned in the right circles, to the right people. Constantine heard about it within hours. His hands did not shake as he wrote instructions to his solicitor. His voice did not waver as he specified the terms. He would pay £500, a fortune for Sir William, pocket change for a duke, in exchange for Octavia's hand in marriage. The wedding would take place within a week. There would be no negotiation, no extended engagement, no opportunity for Sir William to seek other offers. 7 years. He had waited 7 years for this moment. Prepared, watched, protected. Become a man who deserved her rather than just a man who wanted her. Now or never. Let me pause here to explain the economics of what just happened, because understanding the money involved is crucial to understanding the transaction. £500 in 1847 was a significant sum, equivalent to roughly £65,000 today, or about 80,000 American dollars. For a ruined gentleman like Sir William, drowning in debts that totaled 10 times that amount, it was a lifeline. It would clear his most pressing obligations and buy him time to make new mistakes, to dig himself into new holes. For the Duke of Redmore, it was nothing. Constantine's annual income exceeded £40,000, nearly 100 times what he paid for Octavia. He could have paid 10 times that amount without noticing the loss. The £500 was not a measure of her value. It was simply the price of Sir William's cooperation. But to Octavia, when she learned the number, it felt like a verdict. £500. That was what her father had decided she was worth. She learned of her fate on a grey Tuesday morning, summoned to her father's study like a servant called to account for missing silver. "You're to be married," Sir William said without preamble. He was already pouring himself a drink, unable to meet her eyes. "To the Duke of Redmore, Saturday." The words didn't make sense. Octavia stood very still in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to pass them into meaning. The Duke of... Her voice failed. She had heard the name, of course. Everyone had heard the name. The Duke of Redmore was one of the most powerful men in England, infamous for his coldness, his reclusiveness, his complete disinterest in society. She had seen him at events over the years, a tall figure in dark clothing, always standing apart, watching but never participating. She had never spoken to him. She could barely picture his face. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What's to understand?" Sir William drained his glass. He offered. "I accepted. You'll be a duchess. You should be grateful." Grateful? The word struck her like a blow. "Father, we've never had a conversation." "Then you'll have plenty of time for conversation after you're married." He finally looked at her. and his expression was a mixture of guilt and defiance that made her stomach turn. "This is the best offer you'll ever receive, Octavia. Possibly the only offer. Don't be foolish enough to refuse it." "And if I do refuse?" Sir William laughed. It was not a kind sound. "And do what? Live on the streets? Become a governess? Throw yourself on the mercy of relatives who've made it clear they want nothing to do with us?" He gestured vaguely toward the door. "You have nothing. No money, no prospects, no future. The Duke is willing to take you off my hands, and I have accepted. The matter is settled." Octavia opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to say something, but the words died in her throat. Because he was right. She had nothing. She was nothing. She was exactly what society had always told her she was: a burden to be managed, a mouth to be fed, a daughter to be sold. She walked back to her room, her tiny room near the servants' quarters, on numb legs. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She looked at the walls that had been her prison for 2 years. £500. She had learned this from the servants, who knew everything that happened in any household. Her father had sold her for £500. She thought she should cry. That seemed like the appropriate response. But the tears wouldn't come. Instead, she felt a strange, hollow calm. The calm of someone who has already accepted that they are drowning and has stopped struggling against the water. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that across London the Duke of Redmore stood at the window of his study, staring out at a city he had never loved, his heart pounding with a mixture of elation and terror. 7 years. 7 years of waiting, watching, protecting, wanting. And now, in 4 days, she would be his. What if she hated him? What if she spent the rest of her life wishing she had been sold to anyone else? What if the reality of Octavia, the actual woman, not the ideal he had built in his mind over 7 lonely years, fell short of everything he had imagined? Or worse? What if he fell short? What if he was too strange, too intense, too damaged to be the husband she deserved? Constantine pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. It didn't matter. Even if she hated him, even if she never learned to love him, he would spend the rest of his life ensuring her happiness. He would give her everything: freedom, wealth, security, comfort, and ask nothing in return except the privilege of being near her. That would have to be enough. It would have to be. The wedding was small, held in the chapel at Redmore rather than in London, away from the prying eyes of society. Dorothea had protested. A duchess in the family should mean a grand celebration, a chance to parade their connection before the ton. But Constantine had refused. He had no interest in performance. He wanted only to make Octavia legally his before something went wrong. Octavia wore her mother's wedding dress, preserved for 25 years in lavender and tissue paper. The style was hopelessly outdated. The silk slightly yellowed with age, but it was the only thing of value she owned that Dorothea hadn't managed to claim. She pinned her hair up, herself, using skills she had learned when the lady's maid was let go. In the mirror, she looked like a ghost, a woman already dead, going through motions that meant nothing. She walked to the chapel with her father, who said nothing the entire way. When they reached the door, he patted her hand once, awkwardly, guiltily, and then departed. He claimed a headache, but really he couldn't face the shame of what he'd done. So Octavia walked toward her fate alone. The chapel was small and beautiful, filled with candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. A handful of witnesses sat in the pews, strangers, all of them, servants and solicitors who meant nothing to her. At the altar, a vicar waited with an open book, and beside him stood the Duke of Redmore. Constantine watched her walk toward him, and he forgot to breathe. She was wearing her mother's dress. He knew this. His investigators had told him about the dress, preserved all these years, and he had hoped she would choose it. The outdated style made her look like she had stepped out of another era. A woman from a time when romance meant something, when love was worth preserving. She was so thin, too thin. He could see the bones of her clavicle, the sharpness of her shoulders beneath the yellowed silk. Dorothea had been starving her, he realized. Not obviously, not in ways that could be called abuse, but subtly, giving her the smallest portions, the poorest cuts, the leftovers no one else wanted. He would fix that. He would fix everything. He would spend the rest of his life making sure she never wanted for anything again. Octavia reached the altar and raised her eyes to look at him. She saw a tall man with dark hair and pale grey eyes that burned with an intensity she couldn't name. His face was handsome in an austere way, all sharp angles and controlled expression. He looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world, as if the chapel, the vicar, the handful of witnesses, none of it existed. Only her. No one had ever looked at her like that. No one had ever looked at her as if she mattered. The ceremony was brief. Octavia spoke her vows in a voice that didn't tremble, though she couldn't feel her lips forming the words. She felt Constantine's hand, warm and steady, as he slid a ring onto her finger. She felt his eyes on her face throughout, never looking away, never blinking. And then, it was done. She was a duchess. She was his. They departed immediately after the ceremony, travelling by private coach toward Redmore. The carriage was luxurious. Velvet seats, silk curtains, a small compartment with refreshments she couldn't bring herself to touch. Octavia sat rigidly in her seat, staring out the window at the passing countryside. The estates of London gave way to rolling farmland, to villages that grew smaller and smaller, to countryside that seemed to stretch forever. She was leaving everything she knew. Not that there was much to leave, no friends, no family. Worth the name, no home that had felt like home in years. But still, the familiar had a comfort that the unknown could not offer, and the unknown was a man who had purchased her, a man she had never spoken to, a man who was now, legally, her master in every way that mattered. Constantine sat across from her watching, always watching. His intensity should have been unnerving, and it was, but it was also the most attention Octavia had received in years, perhaps ever. An hour into the journey, he spoke. "I have something for you." He handed her a document. Octavia took it with trembling fingers, not understanding what she was looking at. The paper was heavy, expensive. Legal language filled the page, whereases and therefores and provisions that blurred together. She read it once, then again, certain she was misunderstanding. The document guaranteed her financial independence, a substantial annual allowance, £5,000, 10 times what her father had received for her, placed, in her name, accessible without her husband's permission. The document guaranteed her personal autonomy, the right to come and go as she pleased, to maintain her own correspondence, to make her own decisions about her daily life. And the document guaranteed her the right to leave. If at any point she wished to end their marriage, she would be provided with a home of her own, a continued allowance, and complete freedom from any obligation to him. She would not be divorced. Divorce was nearly impossible in Victorian England and carried devastating stigma. But they would live separately, and she would be under no compulsion to see him or speak to him ever again. Now, I need to explain why this document was so extraordinary, why it represents perhaps the most significant thing Constantine could have given her. Under the legal doctrine of coverture that governed Victorian England, a married woman had no independent legal existence. The moment she spoke her wedding vows, she became, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband rather than a person in her own right. Her property became his property. Any money she earned belonged to him. Any inheritance she received could be claimed by him. She could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued, could not conduct business without his permission. Even her body belonged to him. A husband could not be charged with assaulting his wife because assault required the victim to be a separate legal person, and a wife was not. When Octavia said "I do," She signed away her legal existence entirely. Constantine now had the power to control every aspect of her life: where she lived, what she wore, whom she spoke to, how she spent her days. He could lock her in a room and no one would question it. He could take everything she owned and no one would stop him. He could do virtually anything he wanted to her, and the law would protect him. And his first act as her husband was to give that power back. I don't understand. Her voice came out as a whisper. The law gives me total control over you. Constantine's voice was quiet, steady, but she could see his hands clenched in his lap. Under coverture, you no longer exist as a legal person. Your property is my property. Your body is mine to command. Your very identity has been subsumed into mine. He paused. I wanted you to know that I have no intention of exercising that control. You are not my prisoner, Octavia. You are not my property. If you stay with me, it will be because you choose to stay. And if you ever wish to leave, I will not stop you. She stared at him. This man she didn't know. This man who had purchased her from her father like a horse at auction. This man who had just signed away every legal advantage that marriage gave him. Why? It was the only word she could manage. Constantine was silent for a long moment. The carriage wheels rattled over a rough patch of road. Outside, the countryside had grown wilder, more beautiful. Hills and forests that belonged to his estates, land that stretched as far as the eye could see. Because I need you to understand that your staying will always be a choice, he said finally. His voice was rough, as if the words cost him something. Because I have? He stopped, swallowed. There are things I need to tell you, things that may make you want to use that document tonight, but I cannot marry you. I cannot share a life with you without you knowing the truth. What truth? He didn't answer. He only looked at her with those burning grey eyes, and Octavia felt her heart begin to pound. They arrived at Redmore as the sun was setting, painting the massive estate in shades of gold and amber. Octavia had never seen anything so grand. The house rose from manicured grounds like a palace from a fairy tale. Hundreds of windows glittering in the fading light, towers and turrets reaching toward the darkening sky. The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance and a footman opened the door. Constantine stepped out first, then turned to offer Octavia his hand. She took it, his fingers warm and strong around hers, and let him help her down. The staff had lined up to greet their new duchess. Dozens of servants in crisp uniforms, their faces warm with genuine welcome. This wasn't the false courtesy Octavia had grown used to at home, the barely concealed contempt of servants who knew she had no power. These people looked at her with something like hope. Your Grace. The housekeeper, an older woman with kind eyes and grey hair, curtsied deeply. We're so pleased to welcome you to Redmore. I'm Mrs. Paxton, and I've been housekeeper here for 30 years. If there's anything you need, anything at all, you have only to ask. Thank you, Octavia managed. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and uncertain. His Grace has given instructions for your chambers to be prepared exactly to your preferences, Mrs. Paxton continued, and the kitchen has prepared all your favourite dishes for dinner. We do hope you'll be comfortable here. His Grace has given instructions. His Grace has prepared. Everything, it seemed, had been arranged for her comfort by a man who claimed he wanted nothing from her except the chance to earn her love. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Octavia was shown to her chambers by Mrs. Paxton and a young maid named Sarah, who would serve as her lady's maid. The rooms were beautiful, more beautiful than anything Octavia had ever seen. Blue silk wallpaper the colour of summer sky. A canopied bed with linens so soft she was afraid to touch them. A writing desk by the window, already stocked with paper and ink and everything she could need. Fresh flowers on every surface, roses and lilies and flowers she couldn't name, filling the air with sweetness. and books. Shelves of books, lining an entire wall. Octavia drifted toward them almost without realizing, her fingers reaching out to touch the spines. A Tale of Two, Cities, Jane Eyre, poetry by Keats and Shelley and Byron, novels she had mentioned loving years ago, at parties she couldn't even remember, books she had dreamed of owning but could never afford. How did he know? His Grace asked that the library be stocked with your favourites, Sarah said, helping Octavia out of her travelling clothes. He said you were a great reader. How did he… Octavia stopped herself. The question felt dangerous somehow, as if asking it would open a door she wasn't ready to walk through. She bathed and dressed for dinner in a gown that had been waiting in her wardrobe, deep blue silk that matched her eyes, cut in the latest fashion, fitting her perfectly. More impossible knowledge, more evidence of attention she didn't understand. Dinner was served in a small dining room. Intimate, Mrs. Paxton explained, because His Grace thought the great dining hall might be overwhelming on her first night. They sat at opposite ends of a table meant for 8, and servants brought course after course of food that was, impossibly, every single thing she loved to eat. Roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread with butter, chocolate cake for dessert, her favourite since childhood, something she hadn't tasted in years because Dorothea considered chocolate an unnecessary expense. Constantine barely ate. He watched her instead, tracking every bite she took, every sip of wine, every shift of expression across her face. It should have been unnerving. It was unnerving, but it was also oddly comforting. After years of being invisible, of being overlooked, of being treated as if her presence was an inconvenience, being watched so intently felt almost like being seen. After dinner, Constantine rose and held out his hand. "There's something I need to show you." Octavia hesitated. Every instinct she had developed over years of surviving warned her against trusting this man. He was too powerful, too strange, too focused on her in ways she couldn't explain. Whatever was behind the door he wanted to open, it could change everything. But she had already signed her life over to him. She had already stepped into the unknown. What was one more step? She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm, gentle, trembling slightly though he tried to hide it. He led her through the house, up a grand staircase, down a corridor lined with portraits of Harcourt ancestors, to a door that was locked. He produced a key from his waistcoat pocket. His hand shook visibly as he fitted it into the lock. "What I'm about to show you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "will either make you understand or make you despise me. I accept either outcome. But I cannot," his voice cracked, "I cannot be your husband without you knowing what I am." He opened the door. The room was small, lit by a single lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And those walls… Octavia stepped forward as if drawn by an invisible force. The walls were covered in sketches. Hundreds of them. All of her. She saw herself at 16, reading in a garden, tears on her cheeks. She saw herself at 18, standing at her mother's grave, her face carved from ice. She saw herself at 20, at 22, at 23. Wearing gowns she remembered, attending events she remembered, captured in moments she had thought no one noticed. Here was a sketch of her laughing at something. She couldn't remember what, but the artist had captured the exact curve of her smile, the crinkles around her eyes. Here was a sketch of her looking out a window, her expression distant and sad. Here was a sketch of her with her mother, reading together, their heads bent close over a book. How did anyone have a sketch of her with her mother? Her mother had been dead for 5 years, and on the desk, arranged with careful precision in a glass-fronted case, were objects that stopped her breath entirely. A green silk ribbon. She had lost it years ago. It had fallen from her hair at a musicale, and she had mourned its loss because her mother had given it to her. A pressed rose. Brown and fragile now, but she recognised it. From a bouquet she had carried at the Ashby garden party, the very event where this had all begun. A page of handwriting. Her handwriting. Someday, someone will look at me and see something worth keeping. Octavia's knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the desk, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to process what she was seeing. 7 years. He had been watching her for 7 years. He had kept her ribbon, her flower, her words. He had commissioned hundreds of sketches of her face. He had built a shrine to her in a locked room of his ancestral home. She turned to face him. Constantine stood in the doorway. He hadn't moved. His face was white as paper, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked like a man awaiting the executioner's blade. 7 years, he said. His voice was raw, broken, barely recognizable. I have watched you for 7 years. Since the Ashby Garden party. Since I saw you reading alone and crying over Sydney Carton's sacrifice, and something in me recognized something in you. He swallowed hard. I have protected you. I have intercepted your father's most dangerous debts. I have destroyed men who would have harmed you, Baron Ashworth, Harold Swinton, others you never knew about. I have waited until you were old enough, until I could offer you something more than rescue, until I had become, his voice cracked again, until I had become the kind of man who deserved you. The Baron. Octavia's voice came out as a whisper. I remember, my father was negotiating. He would have killed you. Constantine's voice was flat, stating fact, like he killed his second wife. I found evidence. I confronted him. I made him walk away. And the merchant's son. He beat his first wife until she died of her injuries. I exposed him before he could touch you. Octavia pressed a hand to her mouth. 7 years. 7 years of danger she had never known existed. And this man, this stranger, had been standing between her and ruin the entire time. Why? The word came out as a sob. Why would you? I'm nothing. I'm no one. You're everything. He crossed the room in 3 strides, fell to his knees before her, caught her hands in his. His eyes were wet. She had never imagined a man like him could cry. You're the woman who finds worlds in books. You're the woman who cried over a fictional sacrifice because you felt it, truly felt it, when everyone else in that garden was performing emotions they didn't have. You're the woman who cared for her dying mother with such grace, such love, when you were barely more than a child yourself. You're the woman who has endured 7 years of cruelty without letting them extinguish the light inside you. His voice dropped to a whisper. You're Octavia. You're the only thing I see. You've been the only thing I see since I was 24 years old, and I will love you until I am dust and beyond. She looked at this man, this strange, intense, obsessive man who had devoted 7 years of his life to her without her ever knowing. She looked at the sketches covering the walls, the careful preservation of things she had discarded, the evidence of a love so consuming it bordered on madness, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. I don't know you, she said quietly. Not really. I know. He didn't release her hands. I'm not asking for your love, not yet. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. I'm asking you to stay, to let me show you who I am beyond this. He gestured at the room, at the shrine he had built to her. To let me show you who we could be together. His grip tightened slightly. But if you want to leave, if this is too much, the document I gave you is real. You can walk away tonight, and I will never pursue you. Octavia looked at the page of her own handwriting under the glass. Someday, someone will look at me and see something worth keeping. She had written those words in despair, never believing they would come true. And here was a man who had kept her words, her ribbons, her flowers, who had watched over her for 7 years, who had given her the legal power to leave him before he had even shown her why she might want to stay. Show me, she whispered. Show me who you are. The months that followed were the strangest, most wonderful months of Octavia's life. Constantine was, she had been right, strange. There was no other word for it. He fixated on her with an intensity that should have been frightening. He appeared in doorways the moment she thought of him, as if summoned by her mind. He tracked her movements through the house, always knowing where she was, what she was doing, what she might need before she needed it. But he was also unbearably gentle. He never touched her without permission, never demanded her presence, only invited it with eyes that held no expectation. He filled the library with books he thought she might enjoy and spent evenings reading beside her in comfortable silence. He remembered every detail, her favourite foods, her preferred flowers, the way she liked her tea, the exact temperature of the bath that helped her headaches. She tested him. She had to. Years of disappointment had taught her not to trust kindness that came without cost. She told him she wanted to visit the village alone, without chaperone or escort. He ordered the carriage prepared within the hour and didn't ask where she was going or when she would return. She told him she wanted to write letters to old friends, school companions she had lost touch with during her years of isolation. He provided paper, ink, sealing wax, and the address of every girl she mentioned, compiled from sources she didn't ask about. She told him she wanted to redecorate her chambers in a different colour. He had craftsmen at Redmore within the week, ready to remake the rooms according to her exact specifications. "You're not going to argue?" she asked, after the fourth or fifth test. "You're not going to tell me I'm being foolish or wasteful, or that I should be grateful for what I have?" Constantine looked at her with those steady grey eyes. "Why would I argue? You're not asking for anything unreasonable. You're asking for the freedom to make your own choices." He paused. "You've never had that before, have you?" "No." The word came out smaller than she intended. "No, I haven't." "Then make all the choices you want. Redecorate every room in this house. Visit every village in England. Write to every person you've ever met." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. And when she didn't, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with infinite gentleness. "I told you, Octavia. Your staying will always be a choice. I want you to believe that. I want you to know it in your bones." She started to believe it. The moment she truly understood came 3 months into their marriage, on a night when she couldn't sleep. She had been dreaming of her mother, of the last days, the terrible coughing, the blood on the handkerchiefs she tried to hide. She woke gasping, tears on her cheeks, and couldn't settle back to sleep. So she did what she always did when sleep wouldn't come. She went to the library. The fire had burned low, but there was enough light to read by. She curled into her favourite chair. She had a favourite chair now after only 3 months, because Constantine had noticed which one she preferred and had it moved closer to the fire, and opened a book at random. She didn't hear him enter. She only felt the air change the way it always changed when he was near. And when she looked up, he was standing in the doorway in his dressing gown, his hair dishevelled, his eyes soft with concern. "I heard you walk past my door," he said quietly. "Is everything all right?" A nightmare. My mother. She didn't know why she told him the truth. She could have lied, could have said she simply wasn't tired, but the words came out before she could stop them. "I was dreaming of her death." He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her that time heals all wounds or that her mother was in a better place. He simply crossed the room, sat in the chair across from her and said, "Tell me about her." So she did. For hours she talked about her mother, the way she laughed, the books she loved, the songs she sang while brushing Octavia's hair. She talked about the illness, the slow fade, the terrible last weeks when every breath was a struggle. She talked about the funeral, the cold, the way her father had left her standing alone at the grave. Constantine listened. He asked questions, not intrusive ones, just gentle prompts to keep her talking. And when she finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, he said something that broke her open entirely. "She would be proud of you, not because you Survived? Though you did survive, against every odd, but because you remained kind. You could have become bitter. You could have become cruel. You had every reason to close yourself off, to stop feeling, to become as cold as the people who hurt you. His voice was soft. But you didn't. You kept your heart open. You kept believing that someday things would be better. That takes courage, Octavia. That takes strength. And your mother, the woman who raised you, who loved you, who taught you to find worlds in books, she would be so proud of the woman you've become. Octavia wept then, not quiet, dignified tears, but great racking sobs that shook her whole body. And Constantine, her strange, intense, obsessive husband, simply moved to sit beside her, gathered her into his arms, and held her while she cried. She fell asleep there, in his arms, and when she woke the next morning, she was in her own bed, still in her dressing gown with a blanket tucked carefully around her. He must have carried her. He must have put her to bed and tucked her in and left without asking for anything in return. That was the moment she knew she was beginning to love him. A week later, she caught him watching her sleep. She had woken in the middle of the night, not from a nightmare this time, just a natural stirring, and in the dim light from the dying fire, she saw him. He was sitting in a chair he had pulled close to her bedside, his eyes fixed on her face with that familiar intensity. She should have been frightened. Any sensible woman would have been frightened to find her husband watching her sleep in the dark. But Octavia was not sensible, and what she saw in Constantine's eyes was not threat, but tenderness. Not possession, but devotion. He was watching her the way some people watched sunsets, not to own them, but simply to witness their beauty. "How long have you been there?" she whispered. He startled slightly. He hadn't realized she was awake. "Not long. I couldn't sleep. I came to check that you were comfortable and I—" He stopped. "I can leave. I'm sorry, I should have—" "Stay." The words surprised them both. She shifted in the bed, making room. "Stay," she said again, "if you want to." He did not stay that night. He was too honorable, too careful of her boundaries. But he did take her hand and hold it until she fell asleep again. And in the morning, when she woke, he was still there, slumped in the chair, her hand still clasped in his. She smiled. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she woke up smiling. The first time she saw his darkness was at a ball in March, 4 months after their wedding. They had been invited to a celebration at the home of Lord and Lady Ashby, the same family whose garden party had started everything. Constantine had been reluctant to attend. He hated social events, hated the performance and the falseness. But Octavia wanted to go. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to walk into a ballroom on the arm of one of the most powerful men in England and let everyone who had ever overlooked her see what she had become. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, with diamonds at her throat and in her hair. Constantine had given her the diamonds the night before, a parure that had belonged to his mother, the only woman he had ever loved before Octavia. "They suit you," he had said quietly, fastening the necklace around her throat. His fingers had lingered on her skin, warm and gentle. "She would have wanted you to have them." They arrived at the Ashby ball as a sensation. The Duchess of Redmore, née the forgotten Mercer girl, transformed beyond recognition. The Duke of Redmore, rarely seen in society, attending for the first time in years. Whispers followed them through the room. Eyes tracked their every movement. Octavia loved it. She danced with Constantine twice, once a waltz, once a quadrille, and she felt the eyes of every person in the room watching them, his hand at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. They moved together as if they had been dancing together for years, and perhaps in some way they had. He had been watching her for 7 years. He knew exactly how she moved. When the second dance ended, Octavia excused herself to get refreshment. Constantine watched her go. He always watched her go, and she felt his gaze like a physical touch as she crossed the room. She was standing by the punch bowl when Lord Carlisle approached her. He was handsome, very handsome, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a smile that had probably charmed 100 women before her. He was also, she knew from gossip, a notorious rake. The kind of man who pursued married women as sport. Your Grace. He bowed over her hand, lips lingering a moment too long on her gloved fingers. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. Lord Carlisle. She withdrew her hand. I've heard of you. Only good things, I hope. His smile widened. Though somehow I doubt it. My reputation precedes me, I'm afraid. It does. And yet, here you are, talking to me. He stepped closer, too close, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur. I have to say, Your Grace, you're far more beautiful than I expected. When I heard Redmore had married some impoverished nobody, I assumed, well, I assumed wrong. His eyes travelled down her body with obvious appreciation. Tell me, does your husband appreciate what he has? He doesn't seem the type to properly worship a woman of your quality. Octavia opened her mouth to deliver the cutting response Lord Carlisle deserved, but before she could speak, she felt the air behind her change, a presence at her back, a hand at her elbow, not gripping, just touching, just present. Lord Carlisle, Constantine's voice was ice and iron and something darker beneath. I see you've met my wife. Lord Carlisle's smile faltered. Your Grace, I was just... I know what you were just. Constantine's grip on Octavia's elbow tightened, fractionally, not painfully, but with a possessive edge that sent a shiver down her spine. You were just leaving. You were just leaving, Constantine repeated. His voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. The controlled quiet of it was more terrifying than any shout. And if you ever speak to my wife again, if you ever look at her again, if you ever think about her again, I will destroy you. Not socially, Lord Carlisle, personally. I will take everything you have and everything you love, and I will salt the earth where your reputation once stood. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Do we understand each other? Lord Carlisle had gone pale. Your Grace, I meant no offence. Then none was taken. Leave. Lord Carlisle left. Almost fled, really, his composure crumbling as he retreated across the ballroom like a man escaping a predator. Octavia turned to face her husband. His face had returned to its usual mask of cool control, but his eyes were still burning with that dark, dangerous intensity. The predator hadn't retreated. It had just stopped baring its teeth. That was, she searched for the right word, excessive. Was it? He didn't release her elbow. He was imagining you without your clothes. I could see it in his eyes. I could see him picturing... He stopped. A muscle flexed in his jaw. I am not a violent man, Octavia, but for you I could become one very easily. She should have been frightened. Any sensible woman would have been frightened. Her husband had just revealed a capacity for destruction that went far beyond social games, a darkness that lurked beneath his quiet control. But Octavia was not sensible. Octavia had spent 7 years being overlooked, undervalued, treated as if she didn't matter. And here was a man who would destroy another man simply for looking at her wrong. Don't ever apologize for that, she said quietly. Don't ever apologize for wanting to protect me. His eyes softened, just slightly, just enough. Never, he said. I will never apologize for loving you too much. They left the ball early that night. In the carriage, Octavia sat beside him rather than across from him, the first time she had chosen to sit within his reach. His hand found hers in the darkness, and neither of them let go until they reached Redmore. The first time she kissed him, it was 2 weeks later. They had been married for 5 months. 5 months of slow trust-building, of careful revelations, of learning each other's rhythms and secrets and wounds. He had never once tried to touch her beyond offering his arm or pressing his lips to her hand. He had given her space and time and the freedom to come to him when, if, she ever chose to. She was ready to choose. They were in the library as they often were in the evenings. Constantine sat in his usual chair, spectacles perched on his nose. She had discovered he needed them for reading, but wore them only when they were alone, absorbed. In some book about agricultural innovations, Octavia sat across from him, a novel open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. She was watching him. The firelight caught the planes of his face, softening his sharp features. He was beautiful, she realized. Not in an obvious way, not the golden beauty of Lord Carlisle or the polished handsomeness of society's favourites, but in a way that grew on her more each day. The elegance of his hands as he turned pages, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the rare, small smiles that crossed his face when he read something that pleased him. He looked up, sensing her attention. He always sensed her attention. Is something wrong? No. She set down her book. Something is finally right. She crossed the space between them, took the book from his hands, and climbed into his lap. His breath caught. His hands hovered at her waist, not quite touching. Octavia. She kissed him. His control shattered like glass, his hands fisted in her hair, pulling her closer. His mouth moved against hers with 7 years of desperate wanting, 7 years of loneliness, and longing finally given an outlet. He kissed her like she was air, and he was drowning. He kissed her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered, the only thing that would ever matter. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, he pressed his forehead to hers and whispered her name like it was a prayer. "I love you," she said. The words fell into the silence between them and his whole body shuddered. "You don't have to." "I know." She took his face in her hands, made him look at her. "I know I don't have to. I know you would love me regardless, would want me regardless, would spend your whole life devoted to me without ever expecting anything in return." She smiled, and it felt like the first real smile she had smiled in years. "But I want to. Constantine, I love you. I love your strangeness, and your intensity, and your beautiful obsessive mind. I love that you saw me when I was invisible. I love that you waited. I love that you chose me. And now I'm choosing you back." He made a sound she had never heard before, something between a laugh and a sob, and pulled her so close she couldn't tell where she ended, and he began. "I have waited 7 years to hear you say that," he breathed against her hair. 7 years of imagining this moment, and the reality is so much better than anything I imagined. "Then stop imagining," she whispered back. "I'm here, I'm real, and I'm yours." What happened next, what happened for the rest of that night, was something Octavia had never experienced before. She had expected duty, she had expected submission, she had expected to endure the way she had endured so many things, but Constantine did not want her endurance. He wanted her pleasure. He worshipped her with his hands and his lips and his body, and he asked nothing for himself until she had been utterly, completely undone. When they finally came, together, it was not an act of possession but of union. Two people who had been lonely for so long finally finding home in each other. Afterward, lying tangled together in the firelight, Octavia traced the lines of his face and marvelled at how different everything looked now. The same world, the same life, but transformed by love into something she barely recognized. "I didn't know it could be like this," she whispered. "Neither did I." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "I planned for everything, Octavia. I planned to watch you, to protect you, to wait for you, to make you mine. But I never planned to be this happy." His voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know I was capable of it." "Neither did I," she admitted. "But here we are. Here we are." They did not leave the library until dawn. 6 months after the wedding, revenge came calling. Sir William's debts had once again spiralled out of control. The £500 Constantine had paid was long gone, drunk, and gambled away within weeks. Dorothea's patience had worn thin. The grand future she had envisioned for herself and her daughters was not materializing, because Octavia had not proven useful. She had sent no invitations to Redmore. She had offered no introductions to eligible gentlemen. She had, in fact, ignored every letter her stepfamily had sent. Dorothea had tried to visit once, arriving at Redmore unannounced with Agnes and Martha in tow, expecting to be welcomed as family. The butler had turned them away at the door. "Her Grace is not receiving visitors," he had said politely, "and His Grace has given instructions that you are not to be admitted under any circumstances." Dorothea had raged about this insult for weeks. How dare Octavia snub her own family? How dare she forget who had taken her in when she had nothing? Taken her in, as if Dorothea had been charitable rather than calculating, as if she hadn't stolen Octavia's mother's jewellery and banished her to the servants' quarters and made her serve at dinner parties like hired help. The final blow came when Sir William attempted blackmail. He had learned, through what channels, Constantine never discovered, that his son-in-law had been watching Octavia for years before the marriage, that there was a room at Redmore full of sketches and collected keepsakes, that the Duke of Redmore's obsession with his plain, worthless daughter bordered on madness. Armed with this information, Sir William saw an opportunity. A duke would pay handsomely to keep such embarrassing details out of the gossip columns. A duke would surely provide ongoing financial support to keep his devoted father-in-law quiet. The letters began arriving, wheedling at first, then demanding, then threatening. Constantine burned the first letter without showing it to Octavia, and the second, and the third. She found the ash in the fireplace one morning. She had come to know his habits, to notice when something was wrong, and she demanded the truth. He told her everything: the letters, the threats, the blackmail her own father was attempting. Octavia sat very still for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was ice. "I want them destroyed," she said. "My father, my stepmother, my stepsisters. I want them to feel what I felt for 7 years. I want them to know what it's like to be humiliated, overlooked, treated as less than nothing." She looked at her husband with eyes that held no softness. "Can you give me that?" Constantine's smile was cold and beautiful. "I can give you anything you want." The revenge came at the height of the London season, at a ball hosted by Lady Ashby herself, the same woman whose garden party had begun everything 7 years before. Sir William and Dorothea had come expecting to leverage their connection to the Duchess of Redmore. They had dressed in their finest, clothes bought on credit, gambling on their ducal daughter's willingness to acknowledge them publicly and restore their social standing. Agnes and Martha had spent weeks choosing their gowns, dreaming of the eligible gentlemen they would meet now that their stepsister's elevation had raised the entire family's prospects. They hadn't seen Octavia since the wedding. They had heard rumours, of course, that the strange duke was besotted with his plain wife, that Redmore had become a fairy tale of unlikely happiness. But they assumed these were exaggerations. They assumed Octavia would be grateful for their presence, eager to repair the family connection, willing to forgive and forget. They assumed wrong. Octavia entered the ballroom on Constantine's arm, and the entire room fell silent. She was wearing a gown of deep emerald silk, the same colour she had worn at the Ashby ball months ago. But this gown was grander, more elegant, worth more than Sir William's entire remaining estate. Diamonds blazed at her throat, the Redmore diamonds, famous throughout society, and her hair was dressed with pearls and more. Diamonds, a fortune glittering in the candlelight. She looked like a queen. She looked like a woman who had never known a moment of hardship in her life. Sir William started toward her immediately. "Octavia! My dear daughter, how wonderful to see you. We've been so eager." She looked at him as if he were an insect beneath her notice. Then she looked through him as if he didn't exist at all, and turned to greet Lady Ashby with a warm smile. "Lady Ashby, how lovely to see you. I believe you know my husband." The cut was surgical. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood it. Sir William had been publicly snubbed by his own daughter, a daughter he had sold, and there was nothing he could do about it. Whispers erupted around the ballroom like flames catching dry kindling. The Mercer girl had cut her own father. The Duchess of Redmore had looked through her family as if they were strangers. Dorothea tried next, her face pale with fury barely concealed beneath a social smile. She approached, with Agnes and Martha in tow, both daughters looking uncomfortable, sensing that something had gone wrong. "Your Grace!" Dorothea's voice was too loud, too bright. "Sister dear, we're so pleased to finally see you. We've been so worried with no letters, no invitations. I'm sorry." Octavia's voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly polite, perfectly devastating. "Do I know you?" The ballroom rustled with shocked whispers. No one had ever seen a cut so complete, so deliberate. You, Dorothea sputtered. "I'm your stepmother. We lived in the same house for 2 years." "Oh yes, I remember now." Octavia tilted her head, studying Dorothea as if examining a peculiar insect. "You're the woman who took my mother's sapphires right off my neck. I believe your daughter is wearing them tonight, actually." She turned to look at Agnes, who had gone pale. "Yes, there they are. My mother's wedding sapphires, around the throat of a girl with no breeding and no prospects. How fitting." Agnes's hand flew to her throat. Martha looked as if she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Dorothea drew herself up, rage finally cracking through her pleasant mask. "Now see here, I was a mother to you when—" "A mother?" Octavia laughed, a light, brittle sound that carried across the ballroom. "A mother who gave me the servants' quarters, a mother who made me pour wine at dinner parties while her own daughters sat as guests, a mother who called me practically a servant in front of a room full of gentlemen." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried further than a shout. "You were never my mother, Mrs. Fenton. You were merely a woman who married my father and saw an opportunity to climb on my corpse." She turned away. "Constantine, darling, shall we dance?" They swept onto the dance floor, leaving Dorothea standing frozen in the centre of the ballroom, humiliation written across her face for everyone to see. Agnes burst into tears. Martha was shaking. Around them, the cream of London society watched and whispered and remembered every detail to share at tomorrow's breakfast tables. But Constantine wasn't finished. At midnight, when the ball was at its peak, Constantine found Sir William in the card room. The man's face lit up when he saw his son-in-law approaching. Finally, a chance to speak privately, to negotiate the blackmail terms, to extract the money he needed. "Your Grace!" Sir William rose from his chair, all false warmth and desperate hope. "I've been hoping for a word." "As have I." Constantine's voice was ice. "I thought you might be interested in the news I've arranged to have published in tomorrow's morning papers." Sir William's smile faltered. "News?" "A detailed accounting of every gambling debt you've incurred over the past 10 years. Every creditor you've cheated. Every law you've broken to stay ahead of your obligations." Constantine's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Sir William take a step backward. "The documentation is quite thorough. I've been collecting it for years." "You can't? That's private." "There's more," Constantine continued as if Sir William hadn't spoken. "Evidence of your blackmail attempt against me. Letters in your own hand, threatening to expose private matters unless payment was made. That's a criminal offence, Sir William. Men go to prison for blackmail." Sir William had gone grey. "I never meant. It was just a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." Constantine's voice was quiet, but it carried. The men at nearby card tables had stopped their games to listen. "You sold your daughter for £500. You treated her like livestock for 23 years. You saw her diminished and abused by your wife and did nothing. And then you tried to use her again to extract money from me by threatening scandal." He stepped closer, and Sir William stumbled backward, nearly falling into a chair. I am going to destroy you. Going, Constantine said, slowly, completely. By tomorrow morning, your reputation will be ash. No gentleman will receive you. No club will have you. No tradesman will extend you credit. And every debt collector in London will know your name and your address. He smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. You should have protected her. You should have loved her. You should have seen what she was worth. Instead, you saw only what she could do for you. And now you will pay for that blindness for the rest of your miserable life. He turned and walked away, leaving Sir William gaping in his wake. The story was in the papers by morning. The scandal was exactly as devastating as Constantine had promised. Within a week, Sir William's creditors had descended like wolves. Within a month, the house Octavia had grown up in was sold to pay his debts. Sir William and Dorothea fled to the continent, where they would spend the rest of their lives in shabby obscurity. Their dreams of social advancement turned to dust. Agnes and Martha never married. No respectable man would have them after the scandal. They lived with their mother in a small rented house in Brussels, growing old and bitter and forgotten. Octavia received the news without expression. Then she turned to her husband and said, "Thank you." "I told you," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "I would burn the world for you if you asked." "I know." She leaned into him, feeling safe in a way she had never felt before. "I know you would." Their first child was born in the winter of 1848, a daughter with her mother's dark hair and her father's intense grey eyes. They named her Eleanor, after Constantine's mother. Standing in the nursery watching Octavia hold their daughter for the first time, Constantine felt something loosen in his chest. A knot that had been tied for 7 years, for longer than that, a knot that had formed in his lonely childhood and tightened with every year of isolation. "What are you thinking?" Octavia asked softly. "That I had a plan," he said. "A careful, obsessive, possibly mad plan. Watch you, protect you, wait for you, make you mine." He moved closer, wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter. "I planned for this, for children, for a family, for a life with you. I planned for it before I had ever spoken to you, before I had any right to plan for anything. I remember, the cradle with my name carved into it. Yes," he pressed a kiss to her hair. "I planned for everything, Octavia, but I never planned to be this happy. I didn't know it was possible. I didn't know I was capable of it." She leaned into him, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. "Neither did I," she whispered. "Neither did I." 3 more children followed Eleanor, 2 sons and another daughter, each of them carrying pieces of both parents. The intense focus that came from Constantine, the emotional depth that came from Octavia, the capacity for great love and great devotion that they had forged together. Redmoor, once cold and empty, became a home. Laughter echoed through hallways that had known only silence. Children ran through gardens that had stood pristine and untouched. Constantine, who had spent so many years watching from the outside, learned what it felt like to be at the center of a family that loved him. And Octavia, who had spent so many years feeling invisible, discovered that being seen, truly seen, completely known, was not a burden to endure, but a gift beyond measure. Now let me tell you how this story ends, because it doesn't end with the birth of their children, or the revenge on her family, or any of the happy years that followed. The real ending came 32 years later, on a winter evening, much like the one where their first daughter was born. Constantine was dying. He had lived a full life, 70 years, longer than most men of his era, but the end had come quickly, a cough that wouldn't clear, a weakness that spread through his limbs, a doctor's grave expression and words like consumption and prepare yourself, the same disease that had taken his mother. the same disease that had taken Octavia's mother. It seemed fitting somehow that it should take him too. Octavia sat beside his bed holding his hand, watching him fade. His hair was silver now, hers too. They had grown old together just as he had always planned, through 4 children and 11 grandchildren and decades of a love that had never wavered, never faded, never grown ordinary. "Do you remember?" he whispered, his voice thin but his eyes still holding that familiar intensity. "The garden party?" She laughed through her tears. "You've asked me that every year for 3 decades, and you've answered the same thing every time. Because the answer is always the same." She squeezed his hand. "I was reading. I was crying over Sydney Carton. I didn't notice you at all." "And I noticed nothing but you." Heidi smiled, that rare, transformative smile that had always been reserved for her alone. 39 years, Octavia. 39 years since I first saw you in that garden, and I have loved you for every single day of them." "I know." She leaned down, pressed her lips to his forehead. "I've known since you showed me that room full of sketches. I've known since you gave me a document that set me free when you had every legal right to cage me. I've known since you carved my name into our children's cradle before you'd ever spoken a word to me." Her voice broke. "You have been the greatest adventure of my life, Constantine Harcourt. You have been everything. And you," he breathed, "have been my everything. The only thing I ever saw. The only thing worth seeing." He died that night, with her hand in his and her name the last word on his lips. Octavia lived another 7 years, 7 years that felt both endless and far too short. She never considered remarrying. How could she? How could anyone compare to a man who had loved her for 39 years, who had seen her when she was invisible, who had waited with impossible patience until the moment was right? She spent those years surrounded by children and grandchildren, telling them stories of their grandfather, the strange duke who had fallen in love with a girl reading in a garden and had spent 7 years protecting her from shadows she never knew existed. On her own deathbed, surrounded by the family they had built together, she asked for one thing: the page. Not the sketches, though they had been preserved all these years, a testament to a love that had bordered on madness. Not the ribbon or the rose, fragile now and faded with age, just the page of her own handwriting that he had kept in a glass case for nearly 4 decades. Her eldest daughter placed it in her hands. Octavia looked at the faded ink, at words she had written when she was 22 years old and believed no one would ever love her. "Someday," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper, "someone will look at me and see something worth keeping." She closed her eyes. She smiled. "He did," she breathed. "He always did." And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Constantine was waiting. As you step away from this story, I want you to think about something. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever wondered if anyone truly sees you, not the version you perform for the world, but the real you? The one who reads alone in gardens and cries over fictional characters and fills journals with hopes you're afraid to speak aloud? I think we all carry that longing, that ache to be known, to be chosen, to be treasured not despite our intensity but because of it. What strikes me most about Constantine and Octavia isn't the obsession, though that was certainly extraordinary. It's the reciprocity that eventually developed. He saw her first, yes, he chose her first. He waited and watched and protected for 7 long years, but when the moment finally came, she chose him back. She looked at everything he was, the strangeness, the intensity, the devotion that crossed lines society would condemn, and she decided that being loved too much was infinitely better than being loved too little. That's the lesson I take from tonight's story, that love isn't just about seeing someone. It's about being brave enough to let yourself be seen in return. It's about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's about believing that you deserve to be someone's everything. You do, you know. Deserve that. whether you believe it right now or not. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are not invisible. You are not a burden. You are someone's entire future, even if they haven't found you yet. Until next time.